Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you. Our distinguished chief guest, Dr. K. Vijayaraghavan, former Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, our Chancellor, Shri N. Vagul, Tara Tyagarajan, founder Sapien Labs and member of our Governing Council, our officiating Vice Chancellor, Professor Shivakumar Srinivasan, Kapil Vishwanathan, Chairperson, Executive Committee, our Pro Vice Chancellor for Professional Learning, Mr. Ramkumar Ramamurthy, members of the faculty, staff, guests and well-wishers of Krea, members of the media, a very, very warm welcome to all of you. This evening, we mark the launch of the Sapien Labs Center for Human Brain and Mind at Krea University, a research center housed under the umbrella of Krea University, and one that marks our collaboration with the very prestigious Sapien Labs, a not-for-profit organization founded in 2016 with a mission to understand and enable the human mind. We're going to listen to some fantastic insights on the environment and its impact on the human brain and mind, but I'm going to share a beautiful quote that I often read in moments of stress and distress. It's by Arianna Huffington, and it goes, "If you take care of your mind, you take care of the world." May I request Kapil Vishwanathan to welcome this gathering.
Thank you, Kila. As many of you know, Krea University's mission is to help humanity prepare for an unpredictable world. This is a very lofty mission, and the centerpiece of this mission is our approach to research, which is an approach that is based on understanding and solving the grand challenges of the world. These challenges could range from machine and human intelligence, quantum computing, environment, sustainability. And we've been launching a number of research centers in each of these areas. A couple of weeks ago, we had the privilege of commemorating the launch of Inclusion Economics in collaboration with Yale University, which is a center that examined or it attempts to re-examine our current model of infinite and inequitable economic growth through the lens of sustainability and inclusivity. This center today is a center that we've been working on for some years now. I think the first conversation with Tara and I had was probably 3 years ago. And this is a center which takes head-on the grand challenge of declining mental health. We published the State of the Mental Health report, which in which about half a million survey, 500,000 subjects surveyed across the world in 70 countries is, I believe, the latest. And the findings are that annually there is a decline in mental health, and then generationally there is a decline in mental health as well. So this is the grand challenge that this center attempts to understand and solve for. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you today. Dr. Vijayaraghavan, who's been so kind to join us. He's championed the challenge-based approach to research in many ways himself. As well as my colleagues from the Krea community and well-wishers of Krea. It's by nature, challenge-based research is collaborative, and it's really heartwarming to see so many collaborative institutions represented in the audience here. And it's a great privilege to extend a very warm welcome to all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kapil. I now request Professor Shiva to share his thoughts on why research is crucial to the world of academia.
Do you need a mic at all?
Because we're live streaming.
Thank you. A warm welcome to everyone here. And it's a great time, I would say, that we are launching a new center, a center for human brain and mind. As you know, mind is a very elusive notion, and understanding that probably will be very useful to us in handling very many issues and problems that humanity faces. So when Dr. Tara Tyagarajan met us about a year ago, and we wanted to form a team which would sort of collaborate with that Sapiens lab. Then we identified from our colleagues spectrum of people. Like we have on the team now somebody who is a neuroscientist, somebody who is a data scientist, a historian, a microbiologist, and somebody who works on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And why do we need such a broad spectrum of expertise? Because this is a multi-layered, multidisciplinary discipline. If you don't have such a team, it's unlikely that we will be able to progress on this. So it's nice that Krea had the kind of facility that we need to attack this problem. And I should also say that this goes very well with the ethos of Krea, namely interwoven research for positive, impactful society, on society. Okay, having done all these things, and do we have the facilities at Krea? So in order to counter that, initially we will be focusing on data-driven research. It will not be anything invasive or things like that, data-driven, with the collection of data from things like ECG and EEG. And we have Dr. Shailendra Swaminathan, who has a lot of experience in data handling, data assimilation and inference from data. And he will be directing the center along with my colleagues from Krea. I wish this center a grand success and make a positive impact on society in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shiva, for your very encouraging words. I now request Professor Ramchandra Guha.
Since we're live streaming the event, I have to use the mic.
My apologies. May I now request Professor Ramchandra Guha, Distinguished University Professor, Historian and Author, to allow us a quick overview of the history of research in India.
Thank you, Akira. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to say a little bit about the history of the Indian university, the modern Indian university, and how it might have a bearing on this wonderful new initiative at our university, Krea. Of course, we have an ancient tradition of learning, Takshashila and Nalanda and so on, but the modern Indian university really dates to the year 1857, and the three universities of Madras, Bombay and Calcutta, as those towns were then known. Now, of course, these universities were set up by a colonial government, essentially to produce people who could function in the lower levels of the bureaucracy and as lawyers and professionals. But there were some very revolutionary features about the modern Indian university that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first was, essentially, they were the first secular institutions in India which drew people across caste, religious and gender boundaries. So women were admitted in Indian universities before they were in Oxford and Cambridge, for example. Likewise, Dalits and Brahmins, Hindus and Muslims and Parsis all together. So I think that's a very important feature of the university that we tend to forget. Now, interestingly, when you come to the question of research, in the first half of the 20th century, when these universities had begun to mature and began to think beyond rote learning and passing examinations and training people for the colonial civil service, they also became crucibles of research. Vijay Raghavan, of course, is someone who would know this perhaps better than me. But if you take about the first great Indian physicists, Raman, Saha, Bhabha, Satyan Bose, K.S. Krishnan, they all worked in universities. Biologists, a name that might be forgotten now, but a great pioneering biologist in this city, B.J.L. Swami. Chemists, K. Venkatraman of the University Department of Chemical Technology in Mumbai, T.R. Sheshadri in the Andhra University, and later in my alma mater, the University of Delhi. So there was some high quality scientific research done. Also interdisciplinary research. Again, this is a name totally forgotten now, but there was a polymathic sociologist and economist in Lucknow called Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who in 1923, 100 years ago, wrote an essay in an American Journal of Sociology called An Ecological Approach to Sociology. So interdisciplinary research between natural sciences and social sciences with a focus on ecology. It's the first paper of the kind ever published by a man sitting in Lucknow University. Now, so in the first half of the 20th century, you had the germination of really high quality research. It was episodic, there were a few individuals, a few departments. I'm not saying it was generalized. But what happened after independence was, in good faith, but with consequences that we are now seeing. Scientific research was largely shifted outside the university into an organization called the Center for Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR, partly because it was felt that we needed to industrialize fast, we needed applied research. So we had about 40-50 labs, specialized labs set up, including the Central Leather Research Institute here and many other institutes all over India, that took research outside the university and deprived young Indians, including and perhaps especially undergraduates, of the opportunity to interact and participate in the creation of research. And the path India took was partly modeled on what France had done, but it was very different. For example, the path taken in American universities, where you certainly had some specialized labs. If for certain aspects, particularly of defense-related research, you had labs run by the government which did not take students. But the best research was essentially done and still is done in the university setting. And I think that was perhaps a wrong turn we took by taking. There still remain some good scientists here and there in our different universities, but public policy in the sciences particularly, less so in the social sciences, saw research as a specialized activity done outside the university. Now, happily now, we are returning to a much more integrative and inclusive model. The IITs, Professor Satyanarayana is here, the IITs now, belatedly but happily, have come to recognize the importance of the social sciences and the humanities. IIT Chennai itself has a very fine department of the social sciences. And I think what we are trying to do at Krea here is making up for lost time by locating cutting-edge research in a university setting where you have these incredibly fruitful collaborations between people across engineering, natural science, social science, humanities, philosophy, ethics, of the kind that was not feasible in the post-independence period because of the somewhat narrow, instrumental utilitarian focus that scientific research was given by the governments of that time. So I think it's wonderful what's going on. I'll just say a couple of last things about this center. I'm sure Tara is going to speak in more detail. But reading the kind of charter and the manifesto of the center, I was particularly excited by the fact that you are going to look at the social implications of technology. I think, again, this is something that in India particularly, the field of science technology studies, STS as it is known, looking at the extraordinary and often unpredictable and impossible to anticipate changes that a new technology brings about. In this case, the smartphone, which I think is and its emphasis on mental health, which will be one of the focus. Then, of course, this is the work, the focus of the Center on Pollution, which again links very well with Krea's agenda and our broader interest in an environmental hub and so on. So I think what we're seeing here in Krea and in other such places is from the perspective of the history of knowledge production in India, a belated but very welcome integration of the best possible research within a university setting where people of different generations, different disciplines, different social backgrounds, different ethnicities can together come to create something that can help us move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Goa, for your fascinating insights. I now request Tara Tyagarajan to introduce us to the center.
So thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to announce the launch of the Sapien Labs Center for Human Brain and Mind at Krea. Sapien Labs is a non-profit foundation, and we share, with the larger mission to understand the human brain and mind, and understand and enable the human brain and mind. And we share with Krea the focus on bringing together research across disciplinary boundaries, and also really enabling real-world impact out of this research. So as Kapil mentioned a few minutes ago, that one of the core focus areas of this center will be, the big challenge. What is the big challenge of brain and mind? It's a declining mental health. But what does that mean? And I want to, as a scientist myself as well, I think it's always bringing that challenge to the forefront. I think the data and looking at the magnitude of the challenge that we face societally is important to see. So, I think you'll all agree that, the soundness of mind, soundness of the human mind is really fundamental for everything that we do, what humanity will create going forward. And I think when I say soundness of mind, or let's call it mental well-being, I'm not talking about happiness, which I think a lot of people tend to conflate with mental health in general. Not happiness, but really our ability, our functional capability across a number of different domains of mental function that really allow us to navigate the world, to do the kind of, not just to come together and create the future, and also really also to live peacefully together. So these are different facets of our mental well-being. Our mood and outlook, of course, is one of them. Our adaptability and resilience, our drive and motivation, cognition, social self, and this is an extremely important facet of human mental function, is how we see ourselves and our ability to relate to others and form bonds with other human beings. And of course, there's the more physical aspects of manifestations of challenges with brain and mind, which are things like, that you might consider typically as neurological in nature, pain, aspects of, muscular challenges and so on. So one of the things we have done as an organization is really build a way of aggregating all of this into a measurable metric, which we call the mental health quotient. And as Kapil mentioned, we run one of the largest global surveys that will get close to a million people a year across 70 countries. And what I want to show you is, what this alarming trend looks like. Right? I think it's really important to see the numbers. So I'm showing you here data from the US first. What you're seeing here is this, whoops, let me go back there. Okay. Over there, this is the overall mental well-being score, essentially, and this is age group over here. And you can see that older people generally have pretty high scores, and it starts to decline with each younger age group. And the red line here, I'm sorry it's not marked, are females, and this is males. And what you can see is as it's come down, I've just put some numbers here, which is sort of the percentage of folks who have suicidal ideation. It's just a few percentage of older people, and you get down to 18 to 24, and it's almost a third. Now, this is the United States, and you also might think that maybe as people get older, that when you're young, your mental function is very compromised, but somehow it improves with age. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because what we've seen is that sometime since 2000, when you look at data from 2010, and I'm showing you some other published data that was collected in 2008, and all of the studies that preceded that in the 90s and early 2000s, that really the young people were always sort of at the higher end, and it kind of dipped in midlife and came back up. Now, this is a pattern in the US. If you look at other countries, regions like Latin America, this actually starts higher here, and it just goes down with age. So each part of the world has been a little bit different where it's been studied, but typically up to about 2010, young people always had the most positive well-being globally. Now you might think, okay, maybe the United States is just nuts. This is just US data that you're showing us here, but if you take a look at the rest of the world, this is not, it's not a beautiful picture here. So I'm showing you here, this is all of the developed English-speaking countries, so like US, Canada, UK, Australia, and so on. And that's sort of similar to the line you saw in the previous graph. Latin America is over there. And then you can see here in India at the moment, the data that is captured is from the English-speaking, and this is internet, we are talking about here the internet-enabled population of the world, not the not the offline folks. But nonetheless, you'll appreciate that with the English-speaking internet enabled, which is everyone in this room, this is the pattern that we see in India. One of the steepest declines with younger age groups. So when you translate that, for example, to what does this mean in terms of the number of people that are actually struggling at a level with their, with mental distress at a level that actually impacts them functionally. So this percentage, this scores, I want to mention before I come to that, is this score at the country level. It correlates very, very strongly to things like suicide rates, sexual abuse, sexual violence, violent assault. And when you look at here, you can see that with the core Anglosphere and India, more than 50% of young people are severely distressed or struggling with some sort of mental health issues and challenges. Now, I just want you to consider, what does it mean when you went from going from a society that if this were to persist, if this trend is to persist, and I should mention first that this is a trend that we know has happened sometime since 2010. There's a data gap for many years in between, but we know it was the case, the same kind of pattern was the case pre-pandemic in 2019, and it's actually just been really exacerbated by the pandemic. Now, maybe it will reverse over the next couple of years to some degree, but one of the challenges that the longitudinal studies have shown us is that people who generally experience trouble or challenges in early adulthood often tend to carry it through their lifetime. So I want you to think, just consider, what does it mean when we're going from a society where a few percent, maybe 4 or 5% had serious mental health issues, to a society where almost half of the people are struggling in this way. What does this do to the nature of society? Because one of the things is, when you are experiencing depression or depression-like symptoms, negative symptoms like that, you tend to view more neutral situations as more negative. When you have anxieties of certain kinds, you tend to view neutral faces as more threatening. So altogether, what this is the challenge, is that this is pointing us toward a future that really that can significantly compromise the existence of civil society. And so this is really, as Kapil likes to call it, what's the wicked challenge that we really need to solve. So I want to tell you a little bit more, and then just about what are the kind of things that people are experiencing today, what's happening with this younger generations. And this, obviously, it's not one country, one culture, it's global in nature. But this is showing you the scale is sort of a bidirectional scale. You could see, and it's maybe too small to see. But basically, as you go up from 5, means it's a asset to your life. It's something that you feel is very positive for you. Whereas when you go below 5, it starts becoming a problem. So 5 and below means that it's a challenge for me. This is something that is not that I'm struggling with. So you can see that older people here, 55 and above, generally see all of these factors as quite positive in their life, and things, very important things like your emotional resilience, relationships with others, focus and concentration. These are some of the most important sort of assets that have shrunk in younger generations where they're finding a challenge. On the other hand, you also have growing problems, and this is a different scale. So the smaller the circle, the smaller the problems. And you can see that these are some of the main aspects that have really grown a lot with younger people. And I just want to point out a couple of these factors. So, out of all of the different dimensions that we measure, these are some of the ones that are really, really significant. So unwanted, strange, and obsessive thoughts. What you find is young people are, excessively obsessing about, especially relationship factors. Sense of being detached from reality. And also, of course, the feelings of sadness and that sort of thing. But suicidal thoughts, which is pretty significantly increased, although not experienced by the majority. Like I pointed out earlier, it's about 1/3 of young people right now. Now, how do we understand this? How do we put this in context? This is what's going on. How do we understand mental health disorders today? Unfortunately, our understanding of this is extremely, I have to use the word maybe primitive at the moment. So, what you can think about today, the way most I would say all mental health disorders, but also many neurological disorders, are diagnosed purely based on symptoms, which means that this is a diagnosis that happens without any understanding of underlying biology or physiology, and with no definitive biological test that can tell you, okay, this is what you have. Now, I'll give you an analogy that would sort of make clear what does this mean? What is the state of diagnostics and medicine in this field? So let's say this patient comes in and he says, "Doctor, I have stomach pain," right? The equivalent is and the doctor asks him, "Okay, here's a list. What kind of stomach pain?" And then if he says, "Oh, I have these few things," and if he's done 2 or 3 out of the list, the doctor declares that you have general stomach disorder. Now, it seems ludicrous, but because we all know that you can get stomach pain from 10, 15 different things. You get the same kind of pain even. You can have a bacterial infection, you could have amoebiasis, you can have an appendicitis, you can have obstructed intestine, but just calling all of it together general stomach disorder doesn't give you a lot of insight into what exactly is going on. We also know from all other diseases that you have a many-to-many mapping of causes to symptoms. So for example, if you had COVID, some people may have had fever and chills, someone else may have had just fatigue and muscle weakness, yet someone else may have had a cough and cold. And we also know that so you could have any combination of symptoms from the same cause, but certainly you could have a whole bunch of other causes that cause the same symptoms as well. So we're really sort of really in the dark and at very much of a early primitive stage of our understanding of what causes all of these different mental outcomes. So there are a lot of different possibilities. Where do you start looking for causes of these kind of outcomes that we see? So, you could have pathogens are possible. I mean, you guys may have read articles talking about how COVID can infect the brain and causes symptoms like brain fog and other sort of neurological symptoms. Syphilis, for example, it was discovered purely by fluke in 1913 that it can infect your brain and you get psychotic symptoms like hallucinations and delusions without any other symptoms of infection. So certainly there's probably, do we understand what pathogens do? Nutrients. We have very little understanding of how nutrients impact our brain, but we do know that some kind of, some nutrients like B12 deficiency, for example, can cause things like, depression symptoms, panic disorder, muscle weakness, a whole lot of different things. And, if you don't know it's B12, you'd probably be diagnosed as bipolar with something else, right? So the third one is, another toxins. We certainly, and I want to come back to this in a minute, but I would say, we don't understand a lot about how our changing environment of toxins is really impacting the human brain. You may have heard, for example, the expression, the Mad Hatter. So the Mad Hatter came about in the 1800s because people in the hat industry used to act a little bit strange and kind of crazy, maybe a little bit aggressive, a little bit odd in their speech and so on. And it was found then that this was actually due to mercury poisoning that came from the mercury nitrate that was used to convert fur to felt in the hat making process. And of course, had we not known that, who knows how we would have treated this. So then, of course, there's all the sociological stuff. Of course, stress, trauma, abuse, people who have been through, really tough times. Of course, it has we know that has a significant impact on your mental outcomes. So there's culture and social structure. One of the things we're starting to see is, for example, countries with high levels of individualism and negatively correlated with overall mental well-being. So there are cultural factors probably at play. And of course, there's the internet and technology environment. Now, when we think about this big challenge of why are we seeing this massive plummet in younger generations, And why has this happened? What's happened since 2010 that's global, that's changed globally, that has could have the kind of scale of impact that we see? So one of the things that, of course, is the internet and technology environment. Smartphones came into, it really came into the world in 2010 and then just sort of took off exponentially across the world. And there, the question is really, why is it causing, it's clearly, there's a growing body of evidence that talks about, how social media impacts young people and so on. But also there could be things like developmental challenges that arise in when people have replaced in-person interaction with virtual interaction right from childhood, that developmentally you don't build the kind of pro-social behavior that the brain is wired for, which is to, mirror people when they, when you're speaking. You have a mirror neuron system, for instance, that we subconsciously mirror body language and things like that, which requires eye contact. There's so many other factors in pro-social behavior, like that require frequent in-person interaction. Even learning, like language, we're all born with the capacity for language, but but if we never use it, or if we don't use it in a spoken medium, we start to become poorer and poorer at doing that. And one of the things that you really see in this decline is this dimension of social self. That's plummeted the most in younger generations. And so are there factors that are changing how human beings are able to form relationships with one another when we're spending, on average, at least the data shows, 7 to 10 hours a day online? The other one I just want to mention, and I think is really worth looking into, is the microplastic environment and phthalates. Now, you may have heard about some of this, that microplastics have really grown exponentially in the last decade, and phthalates are these sort of stabilizers that they coat on pizza boxes and your sandwich wrappers and so on. And they're neuroendocrine disruptors. They're also neurotoxic. We know that increasingly they're entering our food and water supply. They've recently been shown that you can detect them now in human blood. So the question is, what are they doing to us? We already know, for example, that phthalates, there's a lot of research elsewhere that it's responsible for the enormous decline in male fertility, where I think the numbers are that when today's young males will have half the fertility of their grandfathers. So the question is, as this environment is really changing so quickly, what's it doing to us, and how can we address this challenge? So there's these two aspects of it. One is sort of the molecular environment, we call it all the different things that we ingest. But then these are all our sort of stimulus environment, is sort of the sociocultural milieu that we live in. One of the things that we now see, and that's a really important aspect of how we approach this kind of challenge, is that we've long thought about the brain as the brain, and that there's a brain that's common to everyone. But we increasingly see that the brain is, after all, an organ that develops after birth compared to any other organ. A lot of the development happens after you're born. What you do at age 2 is very different from what you can do at 5, 10, and 20. And the stimulus environment has a huge impact on how that development takes place. So just some maybe clues as to some of the things that these kinds of changes to our stimulus environment are having could be having a very profound impact on our brain physiology itself. So this is actually data from India, and I just want to show you, not to get into too much detail, but this is a measure of, this is one metric of the brainwave sort of structure that's recorded with a device called an EEG, which is scalp electrodes, electrodes placed on the scalp that record electrical activity. And what you see here is that as the amount you spend on phone usage increases, which is sort of how much you're spending of data, this is really sort of a transition when you go from the prepaid folks to postpaid smartphones. And you can see that concomitant with that transition, there's a very significant relationship between this particular feature of the brain and smartphone usage. Similarly, we see signatures of other aspects of the stimulus environment in brain physiology. For example, the years of education that you've had and how much you have traveled have an impact on the complexity of your brain. So really, if we think about, what is this challenge that we need to, what is this challenge that we have to solve, it's really trying to understand at the center, what is the impact of environment and life experience on our brain, and in turn, how does that impact our mental outcomes and mental capabilities? So obviously this is, there's so many facets to this, and it's also, we're trying to understand this in an environment that's changing every single day. So how do we really approach this, right? So this is not, as Shiva said, this is not something that is, sort of specific to one discipline. It really requires bringing together of all these different disciplines to really understand the impact of environment on brain and brain on mental outcomes. The other important thing is that because there's such diversity, it really depends on large-scale data. And I think, not just that to have an agile infrastructure for multidimensional human data so that we can keep track of where the trends in the world and detect them sooner before you see something go really badly south. And one thing I would say about data in India is that I think India has a very, very strong history of really being able to put in place strong systems for data collection. I mean, so many projects from government, National Sample Survey to Aadhaar to so many companies that collect last mile data all over the country. I mean, we've had, I think India has the capability for this kind of really large scale data acquisition. But that's not enough to go from data and insights, and I think, one of Krea's really, distinguishing sort of ambitions is translating this to something real world. And so really we need to, build mechanisms within the center and evolve them as we go along to take data and insights and translate them into real world impact, whether it's through changes in policy, public health kind of communication, building interventions and tools that allow you to, that can embed in the real world and maybe move the needle in a real way. So I want to end there, but also say that I think that it's not just a challenge for the center, but for all of us who are concerned about the future of our world, the future of children, grandchildren, future grandchildren, and certainly may be alarmed by these kinds of numbers when you see a third of young people at least struggling and at least contemplating or thinking about suicide. That should really make this a challenge that's one for all of us and not just this center alone.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that very relevant context setting.
Will there be time for questions later?
Absolutely. May I now request Dr. Vijay Raghavan to share his insights and his presentation on what an Indian brain can look like.
That'll be Sorry? Which one? My PowerPoint. Correct. This one. This one. Last. What is it? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me here. It's wonderful to see the intellect, energy, and culture here in Chennai, and I'm very glad I'm coming from Bangalore to bring it down to a reasonable average. It's slightly better than Delhi, though, still. So it was really wonderful to listen to Ram and then Tara. And the nice thing about these talks is that if you disagree with a significant part of it, say 25-50%, then it makes room for interesting discussions afterwards. So we should do that. So particularly Ram. So what I'll talk to you very briefly about is not about the Indian brain, but how an Indian brain initiative can look like. And first of all, before I start, I must congratulate Krea for setting up this center. It's absolutely wonderful. And it's really nice to listen to Tara and hear the kinds of aspects, societal to physiology, which are being linked and attempted in this. And this is absolutely wonderful. There have been really, over the last several decades, since about 1955 or so, when C.V. Ramakrishnan and Rajamal started the Brain Research Center at the MS University in Baroda, where they looked at the effect of nutrition on development of the rat brain. Since then, there have been multiple brain study efforts which have gone on in the country, at Bangalore, in Bombay, at NIMHANS in Bangalore, at the National Brain Research Institute. This has been supported hugely by the government over several decades, and more recently, philanthropy. Chris Gopalakrishnan has funded and started many new initiatives. So this combination of public and private effort needs to come together, and that will be a conclusion of what I'll say. But congratulations to Krea for taking this on. Now, the human brain is absolutely amazing. We can do all sorts of things which other animals don't do, and I'll come to what other animals can do. When we look at a picture, our mind wanders. When we're listening to a talk, we think about multiple different things, abstractions of various kinds, the past, present, future, and no other organism can do it the way we do it. And how did that happen? And what does it mean going ahead? Now, there was a very beautiful study by Hercule Husserl and our colleagues looking at the number of nerve cells in different brains, from shrew to various. The owl monkey over here, the owl monkey has got 1,500 million nerve cells, neurons. The human is amazing. We have about 86,000 million neurons. So there's 86 billion neurons we have, okay? So it's a huge number of neurons, and our brain size is enormous for our body size compared to other non-human primates. So we have a large brain size. So part of our capability, all of what we do is due to our brain size. And what does that mean going inside the brain? And there's a large number of nerve cells. What does it mean? Now what happens is that individual nerve cells connect to each other and form circuits. And these circuits have function. And there are, many, many trillions of connections in a human brain. And these multiple circuits, these multiple mini computers, large computers connected to each other result in many of the properties of the brain. So that's one way of looking at the brain. So on the left is one nerve cell. It gets at the bottom inputs from thousands, hundreds of thousands of nerve cells sometimes. And it sends its outputs at the top to similarly a very large number of nerve cells. And these are chemical signals typically which are received, converted to electrical signals, and then to chemical signals again, and they go on. And they're connected into circuits shown over here, different nerve cells connected to each other. And this kind of connectivity was pioneered by the Spanish neuroanatomist Santiago Ramon y Cajal. But now you can do this at extraordinary levels by laser scanning microscopy, and you can do this in live cells, live brains, and look at circuits functioning. Extraordinary things are possible looking at the way nerve cells function and connect to each other. Now this kind of connectomics, as it were, is now being done at a very high level by electron microscopy reconstruction and other methods of microscopy. So how every single new nerve cell, neuron is positioned and how it connects to every other cell is being done really well. It's being completed almost in organisms such as this brain, the fruit fly's brain, in the worm's brain, and now lot being done in the mouse brain. And Chris Gopalakrishnan's effort at IIT Madras is looking at a coarse level of the human brain. So how the plumbing of the nervous system is in place is something which we are getting to know better and better and better. But how much of the plumbing tells us about function, as you heard from Tara, is an enormous challenge. And it's sort of like the early days of observational astronomy, where we know where various planets and galaxies are somewhat, but we don't know the rules which are employed in this brilliance which we see. But that's what we try to decipher. Now, there are small brains, insect brains, for example, and this was an insect brain, where extraordinary things can be done in a small microcircuit. Insects can respond to vision in a manner which we cannot. They fly at really high speeds. They can, put a straight course while they fly at high speed. They do some things which are absolutely incredible, mate in midair, which we can't do unless we have an airplane. And so this is absolutely amazing, all of what they can do in a small circuit. So to say that the human brain is intrinsically special may not be correct, but evolutionarily, the putting together of multiple such capabilities in multiple parts of the brain has resulted in something rather strange and unusual. What has happened is not just a collection of these capabilities, the sum total of them, or even a little more than that, but a rather dramatic change. And that dramatic change can be seen over here. On the left is a termite hill on our campus in Bangalore. And if you open this, you will find an underground network which is huge, the size of a tennis court. One of the best air conditioning systems ever. And all of this is constructed by termites with complete competence of local interaction, but with no comprehension at all about what is happening. So competence without comprehension, even though you see that in some human societies, is not something which is a human property in general. Humans have this ability, as shown in this similar architecture in Barcelona, Gaudi's architecture, of both comprehension and competence. In theory, every worker knows what they're building, the architect knows what is being done, what purpose it is, and so on and so forth. So where did this ability to comprehend come from? And that is an extraordinary new emergent property of the human brain as a consequence of its size and putting together of all these components, which is very different from other primates. This comes from two or three important factors. One is not in the brain, and that is the ability to oppose thumb and forefinger, and therefore throw objects, make tools, make other objects, and so on. The ability to engineer nature. The other is speech, changes in the vocal cord and speech processing. And thirdly, the extraordinary size of the brain, which perhaps arose about the time, correlates at least with the time when our hominin ancestors could cook food in some manner, and therefore could pack a greater protein diet into a meal and don't have to eat constantly to build a brain, like our non-human primates do. Now, this change in brain size and capability and the ability to speak and make tools has completely transformed our brain and our capabilities and our intellect. And that has happened in the following way. Till very recently, till about 10,000 years ago, we were on the planet of the apes, surviving, and our entire purpose was to manage to survive. So we were, like all other organisms on Earth, fighting an evolutionary battle to be there. But we have moved from that time to something else now. For example, 10,000 years ago, when we started domesticating plants and animals, the total percentage of vertebrates which were constituted by humans and our livestock was 1% of total vertebrate mass 10,000 years ago. Today, humans and our livestock constitute 98% of vertebrate biomass. So we have moved from being survivors on the planet, and as Dan Dennett says, we now wield the paintbrush on this planet. So there's a great responsibility, the stewardship of the planet rests on us, and this is an extra brain situation we have created by not only understanding nature's engineering, but changing that and engineering nature in a manner which will change the planet completely. So that's a consequence, a cultural evolution, which has taken place much faster than our natural biological evolution of other organisms. So we moved, as Tara said, from being on the planet of the apes to the planet of the apps. Now this is something which allows, amazingly, in many ways, the democratization of capability. One can be hard of hearing or hard of sight, or unable to understand mathematics or statistics, and still have the tools which can make you reasonably competent, not like Rajiv Karandikar, but somewhere modestly okay, because I have the tools to understand what's happening. So this is amazing. So these kinds of instruments, these prosthetics, have changed the way the world is. So average IQs have increased over the last 100 years enormously because of these kinds of tools, because the same measures of IQ mean that everyone is more and more capable if they have access to these tools. So these tools have got extraordinary debilitating effects, which we heard about, but they also have extraordinary democratizing effects, and they have extraordinary effects in sharpening the divide if they are all with one set of people and not with another set of people. So this article, I think, was in 2015 or 16, and it claims that by 2020, 80% of adults will have a supercomputer in their pocket. I don't know whether it's 80%, but I think everyone in this room has one. So, the brain is extraordinary. Its extraordinary capabilities has just resulted in a rampant growth through culture. We have created our culture through our brain and our engineering, and in many ways we've created machines which can do many of the things which the brain can do, and we use them as prosthetics, and we will continue to develop stronger and stronger machines, and that's a different topic on how they behave. So how do we go about dealing with an understanding, both in health and disease, of the brain, and all these other consequences on society through all the machines we have created? It is a very important area of work and interest. So what can an Indian Brain Initiative look like? That's what we're at. Now, the problem with brain initiatives, there have been ones in Europe, in America. They went out in a manner similar to a moon mission or a cancer mission trying to solve, quote unquote, the brain problem. And all said and done, after several $1 billion, they have not succeeded in solving whatever that problem supposedly is. Whatever the brain problem is. You can define it in different ways. One would be building a brain bottom up on a computer. Another would be getting the entire connectivity of the brain and thereby understanding function. The other is simulating parts of the brain on a computer and getting them to function. Technology to observe and understand, more importantly, every part of the brain, and technology to understand how function of different kinds emerge. Now, all of these have been done well, and there have been extraordinary learnings from them, but none of them have in toto led to a better understanding of the language of the brain and its function in health and disease because of its enormous complexity. This will be a problem which will be solved better and better. It's not an unsolvable problem, but it's a very difficult problem, and these approaches have built the blocks but have not solved the problem. So in that context, we therefore, by coming in late, have an opportunity to understand how one can do it slightly differently. And as I said, we do have a situation where we have foundations of various kinds on which we can build rather than start afresh. So there's been an enormous amount of work which has gone on. So rather than have an Indian Brain Initiative, I would say we should have an Indian Brain Collaborative. One of the stark failures of our system is the lack of collaboration between individuals within institutions, groups within institutions, and between institutions. That's why they all call IIT, IISC, and so on. So that has to change a lot. So that has to be a collaborative. And institutions like Krea, which are growing, perforce, because if they have to do really world-class work, have to be collaborative and therefore can drive that collaboration. So that collaboration should push knowledge, what we can learn, discovery, interpretation, and application. It should have a major bottom-up component. A lot of us say, oh, let us wait for, like the US Brain Initiative, let's wait for an Indian Brain Initiative. and let's wait for someone to start it. Now that's a process which is top down, which is important and which all of us should push for, but there's no problem because of the foundations we have in having a bottom-up initiative also. That should be pushed, and that's something which we should all talk about and do. It should have a major fundamental component as well as an applied component, because as Kapil very nicely put it, if you have to be prepared for the unknown unknowns, the only way is exploration and understanding of logic and the principles of science, and having many people understand that. And then you can do incredible things. Applications can feed onto fundamental research feeds onto application. I don't have time to go into the details. Now there's a fundamental problem in biology in general, science in general, but also in the brain in particular, and that is the ease of collection of masses of data and potential correlations of all sorts can dangerously conflate conclusions. So data is easy to get. You can say that noodles cause Chinese, that would be wrong. Theory, computation, comparative studies in evolution, and experimental work all go together to give firm kinds of conclusions. So this requires the collaboration of biologists, neurologists in the medical profession, chemists, physicists, people who do lasers, computer scientists, and again, this is something which is very exciting and can be done bottom up. So all of this can be pushed, and this is a human embryo developing, to understand not only how the environment affects the development of the brain, but how the brain functions in our environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay Raghavan. I now request our dignitaries to officially launch the center by commemorating the Memorandum of Understanding.
For the photograph, not for us.
Thank you so much. The floor is now open for questions.
Ram, you've spoken about the brain. What about the mind? What kind of animal is the mind? It's a theoretical construct. Is it something unique to humans? What is the threshold one crosses in evolution before you can begin to speak about the mind? Is it consciousness at a very high level? Is it awareness? Philosophers have written on it. You forgot to mention philosophers.
Dan Dennett, who I mentioned, is a philosopher, and he's what's called a neurophilosopher, a philosopher who understands the nervous system. So anyway.
Thank you. So, to Vijay.
Now this is, a question which about 50-ish years ago, if a scientist were to try and answer this, they would be labeled as an outlier whose brain needs to be examined. But that's changed dramatically in the last couple of decades. The study of how the mind and the brain are related is a mainstream area now, and there are extraordinary kinds of work going on now. There's a recent book I'd recommend by Anil Seth, which is really terrific and addresses that. Dan Dennett is another person who looks at it, and the opposing views have come I'll tell you what those views are from people such as Christoph Koch and others. So people such as Dan Dennett say that consciousness is sort of an emerging software property of the brain, and the brain works by guessing at solutions to what the world is and cross-checking that and feeding back. And it's not such a hard problem in the philosophical sense as we make it out to be. It's a problem which can be solved or is being solved rather well. In other words, just as you get all sorts of fantastic software being done on the same hardware, you're seeing more and more of that understanding coming. People like Christoph Koch on the other hand say that consciousness is a hard problem. It's not just difficult in terms of the complexity of what you need to solve, but there's some new kind of science which is needed to understand what consciousness is. So that's the hot debate. There are different viewpoints. I must say that each of them are very persuasive when you read it, and when you read the other, then you're persuaded, and you read this, you come back and so on. Okay. Now, the second point you raise is an equally important one about when in evolution do these properties arise. Now, there too, there was a view a few decades ago that humans are special, and every other organism is not, is different. They don't have consciousness the way we have. Now, this is fundamentally wrong because, this was a distinction in many ways between Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, the pioneers of the theory of evolution. Darwin believed that evolution took place in stages which included human, and therefore humans were not special. And Wallace had a view that humans, even particular kinds of humans, were special and others were distinct. And this speciality came because of perhaps extra biological reasons. That doesn't seem to be the case with consciousness. Consciousness, sentience, the ability to look at future, the ability to perhaps make calculations about, what kinds would benefit the organism without having experienced this, the ability to do things which require complex learning, that seems to be there in a variety of animals, and in some cases, people have looked at insects and also found very complex situations. Now, that's again intrinsically not surprising. We should view this as a circuit property of with complex output, just as I told you about insects flying. That insects do extraordinary feats of memory, and so that's not unusual. So that kind of property is going to be graded. So whether you're favoring a hard problem approach or a solvable approach, you need to contend with the evolutionary lineup of all of this, and that's again not easy. So it's an exciting area. It's becoming a very hot area of research, and so lots will come soon.
A follow-up, I heard from a great scientist, one of our friends, I'll tell you who later, that non-human animals do not have any consciousness of death, that they will die at some point. So I said, how do you know this? So could you throw light on it? Is that true? And if so, how do you go about testing that?
Yeah, so this, couple of people have said this, that the ability to know that you're mortal is a human property. And that's, an extraordinary difference from other animals who don't, quote unquote, know that they're mortal. Again, I think there are two kinds of answers to this. That I think this question of mortality or many other these kinds of properties, you can view this as a software property, and so yes, of course, there will be unique features which we have which other animals don't have. Or you can say this is some very deep ability which only a hard solution to a hard problem can crack. But I have heard this, by the way, is it Ajit Varki who said this? Venki must have heard it from Ajit Varki, because Ajit Varki told this to me about 30 years ago.
He's working on it.
He's writing a book on that.
So I'm going to ask this question as a faculty, more of a request than a question, that we have some kind of a dyadic relationship between the center and pedagogical practice, and how we can shape pedagogical practice in Krea. It's one of the things that I think many of my colleagues here and I were discussing outside, is that having taught offline and then online and then we don't know what now, we are dealing with the 18 to 21-year-old in a very complex brain environment, interacting with a very complex brain environment that we ourselves have had to adapt over the last couple of years. So it would be great. I'm also a member of the IRB, so this is a very, very pointed question at Tara, that we could actually develop research paradigms into pedagogical practices as one of the sort of extensions of the Sapien Center.
Absolutely, and I just to say that we've started those conversations, and I think you might have been part of one of those that we had, and I think it's certainly one of the goals of the center, that it would feed into the pedagogy, and that would become a critical part of what gets built out.
One is the first with Tara. This is a data question regarding causality in data. So when we look at these curves and these graphs regarding mental health issues and changes in societal environment or habits, are we also factoring that maybe there's also lack of data in the past, in terms of how robust is our data in the past to make those causalities so clearly? I'm just curious whether there is something there.
So I think making the causalities clearly is a challenge, and particularly a challenge with human data for two reasons. One is that the world is a complex, interconnected system. So there's never linear causality. It's not that one thing causes something and then that thing causes another thing. It's more that this feeds back on this, that feeds back on it. There's so many different feedback loops that it's actually a really hard problem to parse out, first of all, the impact of different elements and causality in a system where it's very interconnected and evolving. So unlike, say, animal research, which you can control the system a lot more, human beings can't be controlled in that manner. You can't run those kinds of experiments. So I think partly when you're talking about how do you work with with understanding this with human data, as you get large scale, one of the things that this kind of multidimensional data can do is throw out hypotheses. And then really, I think part of it is it's a real world lab where you have to look at interventions and say, okay, here's the hypothesis, and we can't cut open people and put stuff in there and see what happens and what changes, or give people stuff that's going to potentially be really harmful and so on. So how do you come up with interventions and see if they work? And I think that's really the challenge, is to say that the data can throw out hypotheses, but ultimately when we talk about real world impact, it's really going to come down to, did this regulation make a change? And if it did, then it's probably, you could be a lot more confident that it really was the cause. And if it doesn't, you've got to go back and figure out, well, what other hypotheses can we really draw out from this kind of data? So it's a hard challenge. I mean, and even computationally, it's a hard challenge.
That's why I asked that
absolutely. And I mean, I think today it becomes a much more computational kind of a problem because there are so many interacting aspects, and I think that's going to be a big factor of collaboration here, is how do we, bring together folks. A lot of times the domain expertise, let's say in mental health and psychology and so on, don't come with the kind of, large-scale data expertise. So it's really about bringing these together, and I think also to the point of pedagogy, that how do we start to develop people who have integrated perspective, both the skill as well as domain expertise, that can really tackle these problems in different ways.
My question is to Vijay, and it's kind of triggered from Ram's consciousness prod. What's your take on Penrose's microtubules and orchestrated OR theory of quantum operations at the microtubes level that somehow is triggering consciousness? He has this radical view. I'm sure you've heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, he's First of all, Roger Penrose is a true genius. He just got the Nobel Prize, which I think he deserved a couple more than that several years ago. He's an absolutely outstanding physicist, mathematician, and a thinker. On this point, he may be wrong.
Which is why I asked for your opinion.
I mean, his point is that on nerve cells, there are molecules called microtubules which twitch in ways during nerve function in a variety of ways, and these are there in multiple cells. And somehow these give rise to properties which can correlate or explain, indeed, the emergence of consciousness. Now,
and he says they operate at the quantum level.
Yeah, so basically, by that he means that the molecular changes in the microtubules take place in a stochastic manner, which has an emergent property which is stable, but there are multiple random things which are unpredictable which happen. Now that last part almost lends itself to untestability, and therefore very difficult to disprove that. And I mean, it's quite possible, given his brilliance and his ability, that something may come out of this sometime. But this has been for many years, by the way. This is not something recent which he's talked about. The tools for this have been getting better and better, but there's really no substantive evidence which any mainstream neurobiologist will accept this, which is not to say that they can't be wrong, but right now that's just...
Very similar to strings, because the various modes of vibrations are supposed to be physical manifestations of particles. That's what you can observe. I'm just saying this sounds very similar to strings, string theory. At very high energies, these are vibrations which you can't access. But different modes of vibration manifest as particles, electrons, protons, neutrons. So this sounds very similar to that, and he is a string theorist.
I'll just add something to this, both these questions. Because I think as you were saying that, what is the self, what is the mind, and so on. One of the challenges is that there is no agreed upon definition. And, one of the things that we had started doing, for example, at Sapien Labs before the pandemic shut it all down, was to look at even simple things like, can you agree on something like, what is the thought? And if you ask someone from AI, they're going to have a very different definition than somebody from neuroscience. There are plant scientists who would say that your definitions are too narrow, that in fact plants can possibly have thoughts. And the question is a thought a physiological object that's measurable? What is a necessary and sufficient condition for a thought in the universe that if you saw it anywhere in the universe, you could say, that's a thought happening? And I think we struggle with that. We wanted to bring together a bunch of people from different disciplines to say, how do we then define it? How do we say what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a thought? And it's a very, very hard question. And so that's part of the challenge in figuring out any of this is first we have to define what we're talking about.
It's a metaphor, isn't it? Thought is a metaphor.
Potentially, right? And so you could argue so many different things. The question is, we all think we know exactly what we mean when we say, I had a thought. But what does that translate down to, and how do you say that these are the conditions, or this is a definition that can be measured? And that's really tough. So I think that really hinders and limits the ability to test and figure out what that object is if you can't clearly define it.
Okay, that might be the last question.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. Firstly, congratulations. And secondly, I was really happy. Firstly, congratulations. Secondly, I was really happy to hear so many people bring in the question of evolution. Because you can't think of the modern human brain without the last 7 million years. So when you spoke about it in your talk, and something we work on in terms of prehistory, so thinking of the development of cognitive controls and various aspects of the evolution of brain size and implications for group size, etc., etc. So it was really nice to hear about this also theory of mind in modern humans and other species. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I now request Professor Shailendra Swaminathan, Director, Sapien Lab Center for Human Brain and Mind, Krea University, to please share his closing remarks and deliver the vote of thanks as well.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Part of what really got me excited about the center was actually really reflected in the two questions that both Ram and Krishna asked. The one about what is mind, what are thoughts, and then what about causality? That's obviously a huge question. For us trained in economics and statistics, causality is an important question to address. Clearly a very difficult one with the topic that we're thinking about, but certainly that's really what drew me to be a part of the center. I also want to sort of really delighted to reach out to a lot of folks we talked about interdisciplinarity, and we have people here from the IIT Brain Research Center that Vijay talked about, and sort of the first reaction, so obviously I come in with a very different background, was this is great, we'd love to come, there's a lot to learn, and there was a certain sort of desire to learn, and on the part of the, the scientists at the IIT Brain Research Center, a certain humility to learn and to sort of say we don't know, and I think that's very appreciated, especially for someone coming in from an economics background. We've always felt we know everything as economists. It's sort of like, I know everything, but everyone does not. But certainly this desire to learn is something that draws me as well. I'm looking forward to be really a part of this initiative. We have people coming in now from the IIT, from the Chennai Mathematical Institute, Professor Rajiva, cognitive neuroscientist from Sai University. There's people online from the Indian Institute of Mathematical Sciences, other places, Public Health Foundation of India, National Council of Applied Economic Research. This obviously is an initiative that requires a lot of data collection, a lot of minds coming together. I think that was what, in fact, there was in this very room, there was a talk by Pranab Bardhan, also a professor at Krea and at Berkeley, and he said this, India has been home to some data collection of the very highest quality. The National Sample Survey Organization, in fact, I think I shared this article with someone. National Statistics Day was celebrated perhaps a month or so ago, where there was an article saying that India was where people look to for high quality data collection. Clearly we've come a little bit away from that, but we're hoping that the kind of work the center does along with various collaborators will bring us back to a level where the world can look to India to sort of say, to appreciate the quality of data collection we have, because this is a country with tremendous, the heterogeneity in India in terms of what we can collect is tremendous. The scope of data collection of the highest quality is there. We're just going to try and sort of reach that level. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this. You're all very, very busy people. Very much look forward to sort of staying in touch. There are going to be several sort of collaborative initiatives, with research seminars that we are planning on actually launching. We'll make sure that sort of, we send those invitations around. Look forward to meeting with you all soon and, working with you all. Thank you very much.